let me know if you can see that, Helena.
It's all set. Good.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to be speaking today on a chapter of my book. The book is part of the SCORAI Rutledge series. The title is Subsistence Agriculture in the US. And I'm going to be speaking today about what I think of as like the money chapter, the chapter that people are really interested in, which is how does social change happen? And so the title of that chapter is Without the Garden, We Never Would Have Met Him, Practitioner Networks as a Post-Capitalist Double Movement Activity. So just a little heads up about what I have in mind for today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the theory in the chapter and in the book, what methods I used for this book, the results I found. And then I'm hoping to open it up to a discussion where these webinars can be kind of boring. So I was hoping that maybe we could set it up where as people can ask questions in the Q&A or chat box. We'll call on you to ask your question verbally. So if you don't want to do that, please just indicate like, I can't ask a question verbally. I say that sometimes if I have my baby in my lap. And then if you want, we'll give you the opportunity to respond to my response to your question with a comment or another question, because I think it's more lively in that, that setup. So the main theory I use in the book is this dual process theory by this, I find to be little known sociologist and historian, Morris Berman. But the dual process theory he put forward basically argues that as a social system fails, and he talks about capitalism, but he uses other civilizational structures to illustrate his point, something like the fall of Rome and the rise of Christianity as a alternative, sort of reigning social structure in the world. But in this theory, he's talking about the failure of capitalism, which he argues runs from 1500 to 2100. When a system fails, a civilization fails, alternatives sort of necessarily arise as the system fails to meet presented needs. So to me, thinking about the era we're in, I sort of knew, because I'm a student of lots of people like Riley Dunlap and Bill Catton and Derek Jensen von Donachie, but I sort of knew capitalism was already failing, but I think now I don't really have to convince many people that that's the case, as we see so many crises unfolding. So alternatives sort of arise as a result of these failures. So I have an example here. Black beekeepers are transforming Detroit's vacant lots into bee farms. So the idea here is thinking about like the failure of capitalism to provide jobs and the hollowing out of the industrial Midwest. And then people sort of come up with these innovative, interesting ways to meet needs, whether they're economic or material needs as a result of those failures. And in Berman's theory, he talks a little bit about this concept of shadow structures, which I define as any individual or group social organization that adopts an alternative logic to that of late capitalism, meets presented needs, and exists parallel to, not in direct conflict with, the hegemonic industrial system. So it's important to think of this as a parallel system. The people who are doing it aren't thinking, I want to topple capitalism. That's not what they're thinking. They're thinking, I want to have, I want to address this uncertainty. I want to address crisis. I want to address alienation. So I'm going to take part in some activity that helps me meet needs. So the specific shadow structure I looked at was subsistence food production, which I defined as more than 50% of food needs in my population. And I talked to people in and around Chicago, where I'm from, urban, rural, and suburban people. I also relied a little bit on this theory of interstitial transformation, Eric Olin Wright. And the idea here is there are these, it's a similar kind of theory, the creative processes that get developed in the cracks and spaces of the dominant system of power. But Wright goes a little bit further than Berman in talking about how exactly the nitty gritty of how these kind of alternatives play out. So he says there will be thus a kind of cycle of extension and social empowerment and stagnation as successive limits are encountered and eroded. So it's important to not think that this is a linear process. It's a process that's filled with fits and starts. There are going to be ways in which the dominant system sees these alternatives, taking away some of its power and stopping those alternatives. And then there's going to be creative workarounds and more innovation and back and forth. And a lot of these alternatives, I don't want to be Pollyanna and think like the alternatives are the perfect solution. A lot of the alternatives have issues built into them as well. So it's just sort of this kind of chaotic, messy process. I have this example here. If the stores close, we need food. Community gardens adapt to the pandemic. So, you know, it's this sort of back and forth between crisis, failure of the system, and then people exploring some other way to meet their needs. It should be obvious to everyone, but I just wanted to make sure I hammer this point home that the economic system failing comes in many different forms. We've got this expansion of coronavirus, widespread protests, problems with accessing healthcare, globalized system of distribution for healthcare equipment, unemployment, food distribution systems are breaking down. And I have this tweet from one of my favorite journalists, Ken Klippenstein, who writes for The Nation, blowing politicians' mind by slowly explaining that when people can't afford to live, they get mad. So it's like this crisis we're in comes in lots of different, manifests itself in lots of different forms, and people react in sort of extreme ways to this. And it's not like a coherent one ideology reaction. It's lots of different things and lots of people reacting in diverse ways. The crisis of capitalism that's built into the system, I talk a little bit about this as David Harvey. How can goods sell at the same rate as before if workers are making less in relative terms? So the idea here is that as capitalism, the system itself grows and manifests itself in the way that it's set up, it gives more and more wealth to the richest people and less wealth to the rest of the population. But capitalism can't continue on in the way that it's set up with continued growth if people don't have money to buy things. So the crisis of capitalism is sort of built into the system. If it manifests itself in the way that it's supposed to, it will break down. Again, a couple just different illustrations of the crisis of capitalism. Deforestation, monoculture farming spread COVID. I just recently found this graph. Corn, soybeans, and wheat are part of the negative economy, meaning they make negative $50 to $100 per planted acre. So they only work with government subsidies. So, you know, there's just different ways in which this economic system's completely breaking down. And there were lots of stories in the midst of the pandemic of farmers dumping food and just throwing it out at the same time as people were going hungry. So we see lots of different ways in which this crisis is playing out. So my study, I interviewed subsistence food producers in 3 field sites. I did 60 semi-structured interviews, and I did several hundred hours of ethnography in people's sites of food production. And I just basically wanted to understand, why do people take part in subsistence food production? What results from it? So it was a pretty open-ended sort of theory building study. So what I found is that the process of getting involved in subsistence food production, it's different for newcomers versus old timers, meaning rural people who have done it as a part of their family. That's it's a different process of coming to it. It's just sort of something they've always done. Whereas people who are new to it, they sort of thought about it for a little while, got exposed to other people doing it, and then finally took the plunge. So in both of these cases, we have people practicing what some might argue is this very individualized activity, this very like neoliberal solution, privatized, problem. They feel like they want to have control over the sense of crisis and anxiety and alienation. So they self-produce food. But then I was surprised to find out that differently than from sustainable consumption, where you can just go to the store and buy something differently, sustainable production or producing food for one's own consumption necessarily made people reach out to others for help. They had to figure out where to source food, where to source seeds, where to source materials, how to troubleshoot. And it ended up that these people had these networks of practitioners, which I call communities of practice, that were incredibly diverse. I mean, there was this meeting in February called the Urban Livestock Expo in Chicago. And you just saw people from such a wide range of geography, race, class, gender, age, and they're talking to each other. And it's about the topic of keeping animals. And I found this to be really exciting because the barriers to entry for political action or connecting to others in terms of exploring social change, a lot of times we think of groups like environmental groups or degrowth or some kind of ideologically based group. Like we get together because we share this ideology or this attitude. In this case, people were getting together solely based on the practice. They didn't need to say, well, you need to have a college degree to understand what degrowth is. Instead, it's just sort of like, are you interested in chickens? I keep chickens. Let's start talking about it. And they have this sort of weak ties. So what ended up happening is that as these practitioner networks grew in strength and number, these people who initially started to solve this problem as like a private solution moved to more public solutions as the need arose. So one way in which I saw this manifest itself is one example that came up among people who lived within the city limits of Chicago was there was an alderman, a city council person in Chicago who wanted to ban chicken keeping. And the network of people who kept chickens sort of mobilized in this really interesting way to stop that political, this basically local law from passing. And the way they did it was really interesting. They didn't do what you normally think of as social movement activity like protesting. What they did is they started this thing called the Chicago Chicken Coop Tour, and they opened up their backyards to other people who were just interested in chickens. And kids got really into it because it's happening in the city and they wouldn't, normally get to see farm animals. And so they opened up their backyards just for this free tour all across the city. People came to see the chickens and they both sort of saw that these chickens weren't actually a nuisance, but also got to know their neighbors who were keeping the chickens, gave them something to talk about when they saw each other, and then they would advocate on behalf of the chicken keepers to the alderman, which was really cool. And it was a really smart way to combat this potential policy. And they also, the chicken keepers, sort of crowdsourced resources on what other cities' policies were on chicken keeping. And they sort of shared information horizontally about, best practices and this kind of thing. And, and they stopped the ban from happening. And another thing I saw was these sort of shadow structure economic arrangements. So people were informally using these practitioner networks to foment alternative sort of barter schemes. People were sharing animal manure, compost in exchange for vegetables from a community garden. There was one person I interviewed who produced too many animals in a city lot, like the geese hatched too many or something, and then gave some of those animals to a rural farmer that they had a relationship with, and then in return they got some portion of the animal product at the end. People shared information, seeds, building plans, chicken coops. Like I'm still on this listserv of this chicken people in Chicago, and people are constantly putting up their coops. Like, I just want to rehome this, or I'm moving, or I'm upgrading, or whatever. And food products. So there's just sort of this whole exploding network that I think is hidden to most people, unless you know these groups or are involved. But I think it's kind of exciting, because if you think of these alternative economic arrangements as existing in parallel to the failures of capitalism, when COVID hits and there's distribution problems for accessing food, these people already have built into their networks this ability to access things that they're not able to access through these globalized distribution systems that we're breaking down. So the upshot of this chapter is that I think that these practitioner networks, or communities of practice, can allow for really inclusive social movements. And these social movements are really based on particular activities, ideology, not attitude. And they don't have these barriers to entry of, prove to me that you understand degrowth so you can come to this meeting, but it's a little bit more open than that. And then wait, hold on. I hear somebody talking. Helena, can you make sure that that's muted?
I'm not sure. Where is it coming from?
Let me look real quick. Sorry. I'm almost done, but
it's quiet now.
Okay, I'll go back and finish. Okay, so I'm still sharing. Yes. Okay, so then let's see. These practitioner networks can be mobilized to create new political, economic, and social structures, which I call shadow structures. People can rely on these structures as the larger capitalist system fails. So I have a couple of news points here. People becoming more and more interested in home gardening during the lockdown period. And then just a couple more pieces of news that could potentially be good news. I'm always looking for good news because there's enough bad news going around. We have people kind of becoming aware of these efficient monopolies and globalized distribution systems, but they're realizing that these things are quite risky. And people are more and more aware that supply chains must be shortened and localized. There are these exploding networks of local farms and farmers selling direct to consumers. There's this RICO network in Europe that this was just May 27th. I'm sure it's grown since then. It has more than 1.5 million people, 20,000 farmers, and 500 local groups. Same thing is happening in the United States. A lot of times this is working through Facebook groups. Americans are experimenting with frugality. People are not able to so easily go to stores as entertainment, so they are buying less. And basically, I'm interested to see or to have a discussion on these topics of crisis leading to this exploration of alternatives. Do other people see shadow structures developing? What do we think might persist beyond the pandemic? And, any other questions you might have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ashley. And now I would like to open the meeting to questions and discussion. I suggest that you put your question to the chat box, and then we will call on you. I guess Ashley will call on you directly. I would like to start maybe with a question. You made this transition in your talk from these interstitial activities, to use Eric Olin Wright's language, that are parallel to existing social structure, but not in opposition to it. And you started out that way, then you moved to talking about social movements. But I think of social movements as exactly what you said this is not, right? Which is mobilization of people who are protesting against the existing structure, who would like to change it, abolish it, radically change, and so on. So how do you make this transition between two concepts?
Yeah, so the way I think about it is the people who were trying to stop the ban on chicken keeping from going forward, they're just trying to continue on with their alternative activity. So they aren't mobilized around the idea that we need to completely remake local food systems, but instead they're mobilized around the idea of we need to be allowed to do this activity. So the way they think about it is not in the way against the mainstream system, but instead for allowing their alternative to continue to exist. So I think if I were to use Eric Olin Wright's theoretical framework to explain that, it's basically like the alternatives that are arising are just, you know, like I said before, just to meet presented needs. And they're not arising because people are saying, let's come up with a solution that topples the system, but instead, let's just come up with a solution because that meets our needs that are very material. And then if any part of the neoliberal system or the failing reigning system stops them from doing that, then they will fight that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but doesn't fully explain that to me, because do they ever arrive at the point of self-awareness that they are actually challenging the existing system in your experience?
Yeah. So my sense is that like educated people, the people who are more educated, more urban, more liberal, tend to think of what they're doing in those explicit terms. But the point that I think is really exciting about the way in which this social movement plays out is that a lot of the people involved in this are not doing it for those explicit reasons, which makes it so much more popularizable. You know, like more and more people can take part in something where you can say, you know, we're just protecting our rights to keep chickens in our backyard. And, you know, you don't have to say to people like, we're going to topple, you know, the patriarchy or something like that to make them be involved. So, yeah, there is a small segment, but even among them, the selling point isn't, you know, we're making an alternative economic system. The selling point to everybody in the group is, you know, we just want to be able to do this thing.
Thank you. Okay, there are some new entries into question and answers. Tatiana, would you like to ask personally, or would you? Okay, Ashley.
Wait, let me see it here. I'll click Tatiana allowed to talk and see if Tatiana, do you want to say this question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much, Ashley. I just wanted to let you know that I'm actually teaching a class on gender, subsistence, and agriculture, and your article from environmental sociology is one of the assigned readings that I'm having my students read.
Woo!
very excited for your contribution to the field. It's kind of something I've been hoping someone would write for a while, and I'm glad that I didn't have to write it because I hate writing. So thank you again. My question is specifically about ecofeminism, because in the class that I teach, I frame it as an ecofeminist issue. This contrast between subsistence and poverty when it comes to food production. And I noticed that you didn't use the term ecofeminism, though you did mention Shiva. And so I'm wondering, do you consider your work ecofeminist, and why or why not? And I'll just mute myself for the answer.
Okay. Yes and no. I mean, I think there are gendered aspects of what I saw and what I experienced, but it wasn't enough in the data to make it like a trend that I had to discuss. I do think that there's probably more of that happening. Maybe by more of that, I mean this sort of ecofeminist perspective of people who do subsistence work and having this sort of, you know, female point of view, or the specific gendered point of view in terms of subsistence production. I think it happens more in the global South, probably, but I don't want to make any claims about that because that's not what this study is about, and I plan to, but I haven't yet done enough research to make a claim on that point. But the larger thing that I found that I think is probably worth mentioning here is that I found quite interesting parity, parity, with people interested in these activities were just, I didn't see one group being excluded or doing more work or inequality playing out. I didn't see that in my data. I saw there are some barriers to entry in terms of class, in terms of just materials, and there were differences in the way people thought about this activity in terms of class. But those were the only differences I saw, or inequalities I saw in my data. And I think that's really important because I'm interested in finding solutions or social movements or ways in which we can enact change that are inclusive and where we can sort of connect with people who are different from us. And I think there's a lot of theories out there that can heighten our differences. And to me, the most inspiring part of my data was the ways in which people who were quite different from each other, who might see inequality in lots of parts of their lives, didn't really find a barrier to entry to connecting with others on this activity. And I find that really hopeful, and that's what I'm trying to evangelize a bit when I talk about this book, and when I try to think about social movement or social change, is to think about the ways in which we can play up our similarities and our shared goals.
I see Philip has two chats. Philip, would you like to speak? I think Philip wrote his piece, and okay, would you like Ashley to address it, what's in writing?
Yeah, he said he can't speak now, but let me just read.
Okay.
I'd like to know if you think that this distinct social movement that do not define themselves as opposing capitalism relate to Guhan Martinez Alier explanation of environmentalists that do not feel like that, but just defend their livelihoods just because they live and work depending directly on them. Regards from Uruguay, happy to have you here. Yes, yes.
Would you like to maybe restate it very briefly so everybody knows what you are addressing?
Yeah, would you restate it for me, Helena?
You see, what I see is something different. It says your approach is quite libertarian. That's what I see as his comment.
There's three questions here.
And then And then he moves on and says the challenge, of course, is always in upscaling. As long as activities do not threaten power structures, they will be tolerated. When they go beyond, they will either be co-opted, like Airbnb or Uber, or they will be suppressed. Okay, so you have, yes.
Okay, so yes, I basically agree with this assessment. I would just add that it's important to note that these activities are on the margins right now. They're not the mainstream. And I also don't think it's so hunky-dory, like every person will just be able to immediately start taking part in something like subsistence food production. But I study other things too, like earth building. It's a process to get involved in, and I found that in my data too. So I try to think about this process of upscaling, like how does it play out? It's not pretty, and that's important to note. There's a lot of people who face a lot of inequality, face poverty, and cannot just easily transfer over to these alternatives. And again, of course, the larger power structures will try to stop these things from happening if they feel that they are any threat. So yeah, I basically don't really know the answer to this. I'm watching very carefully about how these things play out. But yeah, I think for sure, you know, there's potential for this transformation, but it's going to be messy, and it's going to be also confusing to understand. Just like a lot of the social movements playing out in the US right now. I think they're quite disparate ideologies leading people to social change.
Yes. So let's continue this next Philip's questions, because they are related to each other. So he goes on to ask you whether is what you see distinct from social movements that do not define themselves as opposing capitalism, and how it relates to Guham and Martinez Alier explanation of environmentalists that do not feel like that, but just defend their livelihoods, just because they live and work depending directly on them, which you already partly answered.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I basically think that that's exactly right. I think there are people in my sample who do define themselves as environmentalists, but they're not the majority. And the same thing is true with a lot of other alternatives I've looked into, something like Earthship, which is a form of bioconstruction. People get into it, or at least that's what they say to me, they get into it because they feel this sense of crisis and alienation and uncertainty. And I ascribe that the reason they have that feeling of uncertainty or crisis or alienation is because of the failure of capitalism. They're not saying that, I'm saying that. Yes. But then, you know, they come to this as a way of, like, you know, taking care of themselves or self-reliance, or, you know, and again, yeah, it can be very individualistic, very neoliberal in nature, until people, you know, reach out to these other people, and they do need to defend their livelihoods.
Yeah. Lucy Middlemans says, I can't speak as I'm an outside. Just wondering if you think the social diversity in people participating in your case is place specific, or it has to do with the subject matter, which is food in this case, or both. How do we learn from this to design inclusive action?
This is the $1 million question. Yes, I don't know enough to say beyond my experience of Chicago, but what I'll talk about Chicago. Yeah, Chicago and the United States, there are cities which bring together people who are quite diverse in every parameter you can imagine. They're nearby each other. And so is this place specific? I think that it's probably accurate to describe my findings. I know that it's happening in Detroit. I know it's happening in lots of cities across the United States. So I don't think it's necessarily place specific to Chicago. I do think that there's other cities or you know, metropolis areas within the United States that this would apply to. I think that there is something about food. I have a quote in my dissertation in this book about there's something magical about food. It brings people together. It's something everybody needs, which is why I started to get into it in the first place. It's like this fundamental way in which humans interact with nature to provide for themselves. So I think there is something about food that makes it inclusive, but I think the things that I've looked into or am interested in, a lot of these have the similar kind of setup where if you think about alternative transport systems, alternative housing systems, alternative economic arrangements like co-ops, a lot of those have similar kinds of, they meet presented needs. They're sort of basic human requirements. And so it's easy to rally people around, you know, bike lanes or public transport or alternative housing because everybody needs those things and they can understand these solutions as meaningful to them personally. So I think if we're trying to think of a typology, we would want to look at the way these people are actually doing these alternatives that are meaningful to them and draw diverse crowds and keep, I keep saying to people like Vandana Shiva talks about this, we can't, if we're trying to think about social change, imagine the entire solution at once and then implement it. Instead, we need to get out of the imaginary and into the practical and look at the people who are doing the on-the-ground practical solutions and seeing how they connect with each other, what works and what doesn't. To me, like the focus isn't anywhere nearly as much as it needs to be on these populations. That there are people doing this everywhere. I think it's on, the onus is on us as researchers and policy makers to open our eyes and change our lens as to who is worthy of learning from and who is worthy of emulation. And to me, these people who are doing the nitty-gritty work of building co-ops, making bike lanes, you know, alternative housing, all these kinds of things, we need to look to them for advice.
Jeffrey Barber follows this with a question. Ashley, did you create a typology of different practitioner strategies from your data?
Jeffrey, I'm gonna just click allow to talk. Do you want to say anything more on this or should I just answer the question as it is?
It's pretty straightforward.
Okay, cool. All right, so yes, the different practitioner strategies. So not surprisingly, urban and rural and suburban did somewhat connect to different strategies. But to me, the biggest typology that I came up with that were clear different groups were newcomers, people who are new to subsistence food production, and like old timers, people who have done it a really long time. A lot of times old timers were more interested in, or not more interested, but doing things beyond vegetable gardening, hunting, fishing. This is just part of their family culture. Whereas newcomers would be like, you know, community gardeners, There was in one of my chapters, I think people kind of find this funny, but venison for newcomers is like this elite food. It's this food that you can't get otherwise. You have to hunt to get it. Venison is deer meat. Whereas for the old timers, the people who have done hunting as family tradition their whole life, they associated venison as food they ate when they couldn't afford to buy food. So it was like their poor food. So there was this weird dichotomy, whereas people were doing across the spectrum, even city people were fishing, which I thought was so cool, and hunting. But so the actual practices were pretty widespread and among the whole sample. But the differences I saw were class-based, and the class mapped pretty well onto the newcomers, the people, urban or privileged or educated people tended to be new to subsistence food production. And then, more working class people tended to be, having done it as part of their family culture.
So Emma Badini, Emma, would you like to speak in your own voice? I can't unmute you. Oh, yes, I did unmute you. I got her. Yeah.
Hello, I didn't really have a question. I just wanted to say hi, and I shared the quote that I think you were referencing before.
Yes, Emma. Yeah. Emma is my, oh yeah, read it to us if you want, Emma. Emma is my intern from the summer. Hi, Emma, thanks for coming.
Hello, thank you for inviting me. Okay, sure. It is through food that humanity's most intimate and essential connections to the earth and to other creatures are expressed and consummated.
Yes, that's it. Thank you, Emma. Yeah.
Thank you.
Daniel Casper. I'm going to see if I can find him and unmute him and see if he wants to say his question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, first of all, I really appreciate you presenting this. And I also appreciate what you're doing down in Rizoma. I find it very inspiring, and I always, your posts on regenerative agriculture and everything, I really think that what you're doing is absolutely essential for establishing a sustainable future. But my question is kind of a more practical level and kind of speaking to scalability and equity. And I have worked with a number of community gardens in the past, done a little bit of research on it. So I'm familiar with the research, but a couple of things. Number one, I think it's really difficult to actually reach subsistence level in an urban environment in particular, but just any community garden, you have your 8x10 or 8x12 plot. So I'm just wondering, first of all, do you see in your research, how many people are actually achieving subsistence level? We'll go with Chicago, where you did most of your research. I mean, is it actually realistic to reach subsistence level? And sort of related to that, if you don't reach subsistence level, what do you see as the value of this? Is this like sort of an effort toward a larger movement to get away from this, sort of late capitalist food system? So that's, I work a lot with sort of the low income side, low income empowerment and so forth. And I see that as a really big barrier in terms of actually, making a huge difference for them in this sort of setting.
Yes. Okay. This is such a great question. Thank you so much. So I talked to people who only did at least 50%. So I didn't include anyone in my study who didn't do at least 50%, and that's self-reported, but people were generally pretty honest. So the urban people who reached subsistence level had relationships with suburban or rural people in order to meet those subsistence levels. So I did have a few people, I had a few people, like, if you saw the pictures of their backyards, like their entire garage was filled with like guinea fowl or rabbits for meat. And then the whole backyard was like geese and turkeys and chickens. So some people were like super hardcore. In Chicago, there's a lot of neighborhoods that are basically suburban lot spacing. So people had a little bit more land to work with. But the way that I see this playing out is, first of all, in places like Chicago and Detroit, there is a lot of empty land that is already being reclaimed to use for agricultural production. I absolutely think that that sort of thing needs to happen in order to feed cities, and there needs to be a repopulation of rural areas, and there needs to be relationships between urban and rural and suburban people in being able to get to these levels, because no, the density for most cities is too high to be able to produce enough to reach subsistence level. But there's these cool things happening in Detroit, like there's something called an agrihood, agricultural neighborhood, where the people within a neighborhood are taking over these lots and using them to grow food. And yeah, there's also problems with, especially with low-income people, in terms of toxicity in the soil and you know, just problems that result from industrial capitalism, metals. So there are issues with that, but the way that I see it, no science, there is not enough science to make a claim one way or another about like the potential scalability of these methods because of like climate change, geography, soil type, like how would populations need to move to make these things possible. But the way that I see it is rural areas are basically emptied out and there's giant industrial farms on them. I see those industrial scale models failing through any myriad of failures, like problems with superweeds, dust bowl, water, whatever it is. There's so many different crises on the horizon for industrial agriculture. And those farm lands, if they could be broken up into smaller parcels where people would be able to sort of be less populous in the city and more populous in rural areas on smaller plots of land, we could get somewhere. But yeah, if I were queen of the world, I would do that.
Now, Philip is asking you, can you share with us in this context some of your experiences at your village in Uruguay? Do you see the same processes playing out? That's an excellent question. Thank you, Philip.
Yes, thanks, Philip. Yes, and this is another thing that I kind of try to hammer home with people is this idea of, I explicitly wanted to use the term subsistence food production because I think there's this idea that subsistence is this like peasant global South phenomenon, like only people in the global South can subsist and off the land. And I just don't think that that's true at all. First of all, most subsistence producers in the world have other employment. There's very few people in the world who completely subsist 100% off their own food production and don't have any other employment to buy any other things. That's very, very rare. And the other thing is that it's just a very similar phenomenon in terms of you've got old timers and newcomers in Uruguay, same as in Chicago. You've got people who are a little bit more connected, not a little bit, a lot more connected to the land. Historically, there's this process called de-peasantization where, you know, people move from rural areas into cities. It's happened around the world, and it happened longer ago in more industrial places, and more recently in less, you know, industrial or developed places. So in Uruguay, people are not as many generations separated from the land and subsistence. So people have a little bit more understanding of basic processes. But the similar kind of idea is taking place. People sense risk, they sense alienation, anxiety, and there's more and more interest in, you know, just sort of exploring solutions to these problems that are meaningful and I mean, basically joyful. And there's a whole part of my book where I talk about how this is sort of enchanting. It's the re-enchantment. It's reconnecting to nature, reconnecting to manual work and land, and then eventually community, which is a lot of, I didn't expect the community aspect, but it's essential, the community aspect to these people succeeding at doing this activity. And that's extremely hopeful to me, because it's sort of this thing that, you know, people couldn't do it alone and they had to connect with others, and then just inevitably made these relationships that persisted and were useful to them to fortify the activity.
That's very interesting. Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up. I want to thank Ashley for really very interesting presentation and well executed, and all the participants, and for good questions. And just want to announce, since we have this another minute or so, is that there will be several more of these webinars, but 2 of them have been already scheduled. So in November 16th, I will be the speaker, and I will talk about the last 2 years, the case study of collaborative work in the city where I live, between the city government, the activists, and the techies around producing a climate action plan and implementing it. And I will try to analyze it. We've been very successful, but it's a case where I will try to tease out really how such a collaboration works, and what within it works and what doesn't. We all talk about collaborative work, but it's pretty complicated to actually make it advance. And on December 14th, Jorgis Kallis, who is the one of the intellectual leaders of the degrowth movement, will speak. I don't have the title yet, but I assume it will have something to do with the growth as a social movement, as an intellectual movement. So I hope everybody will join us. For today, I thank you very much, wherever you all are. And I hope to see you on November 16th. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Helena. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Great questions.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.